McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome. I'm Dennis McCuistion. And on this program about slavery reparations, I don't have to tell you that the issue is very divisive. What you're going to hear are two very different perspectives on the pros and cons of slavery reparations.
And I'm Jim Falk, and you're absolutely right, Dennis. Slavery is a cloud that continues to linger over our nation. And while equality before the law has been achieved through landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the wealth gap between Blacks and whites remains too wide. While education achievement and salaries have narrowed, Black household wealth and the ability to bequest meaningful inheritance fall sharply behind white household. The pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement have brought the question of reparations to the national spotlight. And today we are joined by Donna Jackson. She's with the National Center for Public Policy Research. She opposes reparations. Donna is a firm believer in free markets rather than government as a means of lifting people out of poverty. Representing the other side, a strong proponent of reparations is Dr. William Darity. He's the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy at Duke University, and much of his work has focused on wealth inequality and ways that it might be reduced. He and his co-author, Kirsten Mullen, have just recently published a book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And on a lighter note, Professor, and you did ask me to call you Sandy. For fun, I think it's great that you play the blues harmonica. Let's get started with our discussion. So Sandy, so that we're all really talking about the same basic foundation, what are reparations? And does it always have to be a monetary distribution?
Reparations in our book is defined as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. That's the general definition. In the context of the specific experience of Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, acknowledgement would mean that the United States government, the culpable party, would make a formal apology to Black Americans for the full trajectory of atrocities that have taken place in this country, and would make a commitment for restitution. That's the second component, redress, which takes the form of typically monetary payments directly to the eligible recipients. It has taken that form in the case of German reparations payments to the victims of the Holocaust. It has taken that form in the context of the U.S. government payments to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II. There could be other dimensions, but the monetary dimension is a critical one for a process of redress. And then finally, the third component is closure, which is a point of agreement between the culpable party and the victimized community that the debt has been settled, the account is full. This would only be result in the victimized community making any further claims on the culpable party if there was a renewal of the atrocities or there was some new type of atrocities that took place. But that's what we mean by reparations.
But already I have a question, because you gave two examples, one, the Holocaust, and then secondly, Japanese Americans. So reparations were paid to the victims, the direct victims. In this case, we're talking about paying reparations to descendants 100, 200 years, 250 years later.
The presumption there is that the motivation for reparations is exclusively a harm that took place to previous generations. That's not the case. The argument that we make is reparations must be met for three phases of American injustice, The second and third phase include individuals who are very much alive, including myself for that matter. I may not be alive much longer, but a national act of procrastination is not a justification for not following through with paying the debt. These three phases are, of course, slavery, but they also include 100 years of legal segregation in the United States, coupled with a wave of massacres that destroyed Black communities that had achieved some measure of prosperity, and frequently involved the appropriation of property that was owned by Blacks by whites. And then in the final phase, the phase in the aftermath of the passage of the civil rights legislation, we have ongoing mass incarceration, we have police executions of unarmed Blacks, we have ongoing discrimination in employment, credit, and housing markets. And something that's going to be most critical, and I hope I'll have a chance to elaborate on this a little bit further in our conversation, the enormous racial wealth differential in the United States that amounts to approximately $800,000 per Black and white household in terms of a net worth gap.
Okay, let me follow up on that, if I may, Sandy. First, you're saying that this enormous wealth gap, and by the way, we'll argue with your $800,000 figure in a minute as well, is due to those three things: slavery, the Jim Crow laws, and the racism that is going on today, or at least is agreed by a lot of people to be going on today. So you're saying that's what's caused the wealth disparity. Is that correct?
The wealth disparity is caused by a set of policies that the United States government has conducted that have had effects across generations in a cumulative way to lead to the existing Black-white wealth differentials. And that set of policies starts with the failure of the United States government to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants and restitution for their years of bondage, coupled with the provision to 1.5 million white families of 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories under the terms of the Homestead Act. That's when the wealth gap begins. It's aggravated by further policies, but it's American government action that's responsible for the racial wealth differential in the United States.
All right, good. I've got that. Now, Donna, you've heard him make that case. He's made it very eloquently. Your thoughts, please.
Well, let's start by saying that reparations is not the discussion that we should be having with the Black community. There's far more pressing action items that we should be focused on. Like there's 70% of Black households that are now run by single female women. We know that single parent households have a greater propensity to poverty. In 1965, only 34% of single Black households existed. Today, that's 70%. We actually embrace short-term measures instead of long-term wealth building measures in terms of welfare that had the consequence of destroying the Black family. For the most part, reparations is so divisive. It's only going to serve to further divide the community. The second thing is we know constitutionally it'll be struck down in the courts because you can't hold generations responsible for something that they haven't done. If you have an old man that committed a crime, you can't go over after his grandson and his father for his grandson and his child for that act. So we know that constitutionally it'll be struck down, and you can't say that the government did it. The matter of injustice is a legal argument, and it wasn't unjust in that slavery was legal. And so the courts are not going to do a bend back and turn that argument around and provide for a legal act and then give restitutions for individuals who never themselves were slaves.
One of the points of disagreement is among the advocates of reparations is who should receive them. Professor, would you, I know you have strong feelings about how you would identify those who are eligible to receive reparations.
Yes, well, let me say that, first of all, though, that the motivation for seeking redress from the United States Congress is precisely because we don't think it could happen through the courts. And it's precisely because the United States government is responsible for slavery being a legal institution and for 100 years of segregation in the United States. It's the culpable party. But let me also say that the eligibility criteria that we have in mind in the pages of From Here to Equality are twofold. First, an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one parent or one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States, no matter how many generations back, at least one. And then the second criteria is that the individual would have to demonstrate that they self-identified on an official document for at least 12 years before the passage of the legislation for reparations or the passage of legislation for a study commission, that they self-identified as Black, Negro, or African American. And those are the two criterion. So essentially what we're saying is reparations should be for Black Americans who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States, or effectively individuals who had ancestors who were denied the 40-acre land grants and restitution. One final comment about the single parent situation. If we're looking at the question of wealth differentials, white parent families, white single parent families have 2 times the wealth of 2-parent Black families in the United States. So family structure doesn't explain the wealth differentials.
Okay, let me just ask you this though, Sandy, you do agree that the lack of a father in Black families is a contributing factor to income and wealth disparity and a lot of other inequalities. Would you agree?
No, actually, I would argue that the causation runs in the opposite direction, that the lack of wealth contributes heavily to the situation in terms of family structure differentials. It's the reason why we don't have the same type of family structure, because we observe in all communities where there are high levels of low income and high levels of low wealth, we tend to find that there are more single parent families. I would reverse the causation altogether.
Okay. All right, Donna, I'll give you a chance to rebut that if you like.
I'm going to rebut that. And this is the thing. It's not that it's just a single parent household, but we gave up the government incentivized poverty. If in order for you to be eligible for welfare benefits, in order for you to be eligible for rent subsidies, you have to get to agree to stay within a poverty level. And that's what happened. We know that already.
So I want to get back to really and focus on reparations. Sandy, how many people are we talking about in your view would be eligible, and how much would we be expected to pay on a per capita basis?
So there are approximately 40 million Blacks in the United States who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. And I want to emphasize that this is a case that's being made about the specifics of US history, not global history, not what occurred in other parts of the world. But this is very, very specific to the United States' history. And in terms of the amount would be dictated by what's required to eliminate that massive racial wealth differential that I talked about. Black American descendants of slavery are about 13% of the nation's population, but possess 2.5% of the nation's wealth. And as a consequence, it would require somewhere in the vicinity of $10 to $12 trillion in expenditure to bring the Black share of wealth into proportion with the Black share of the population. That would amount to approximately $250,000 or so per individual. And we think that this is merit pay for America's history of white supremacy.
So how would it be paid?
It would be paid by making direct transfers to individuals who are eligible recipients, not necessarily cash transfers. It could be done in the form of trust accounts, endowments, or other kinds of mechanisms. But the premise is that the individual recipients would have full discretion over the usage of the funds. Now, Would this require us to take money out of the pockets of white Americans and transfer them into the pockets of Black Americans? And the answer is no. The federal government has demonstrated most recently that it can finance large projects and make large-scale expenditures without increasing taxes. One of the key examples is the KERA Act recently. So we would expect that the federal government would do the same thing with respect to the design of a reparations program, which we hope would be administered at least over the course of at most over the course of approximately 10 years.
You are a proponent of modern monetary theory.
I am.
The idea of spending more money, more and more money, until you, quote, have inflation. Inflation, by the way, is happening now. You know, certainly, Dennis. I mean, that's absolutely correct. That inflation is the serious barrier to additional government spending, and I think all of us who subscribe to the modern monetary theory position say that quite explicitly. So, in our book, in the final chapter of our book, we actually try to detail how you might execute a reparations plan so you could minimize the prospect of having inflation. But I absolutely agree that any federal expenditure program has as a potential danger generating inflation. Yeah, and of course the problem with inflation is not just the CPI. Inflation shows up now in the stock market and real estate and other investments like that. So that's a different story. So let me get back then to you. You made the case very well. Let me get back to you, Donna, and say the idea of paying reparations. We can talk about the monetary issues have to do with that, the tax issues, whether we need to add another 12 to 14 trillion to the 28 trillion we have in direct debt right now. But from a moral standpoint, how do you feel like reparations would do? Would this do what the professor wants and his colleagues would like to do, or would this be actually something that would be detrimental to the very people we're trying to help?
You know, this would be detrimental to the people. I mean, there's no conclusive data that shows that if you give individuals a bulk of money that it changes anything. But here's the thing, you said that it won't be decided in court. It has to go to court. When you have Congress, when Congress passes a law, then you see over and over again that it's challenged in the court. And reparations will be the first thing that gets challenged in the court. What about those individuals who fought, white individuals who fought to end slavery? What about the abolitionists and their descendants that fought to end slavery? Those individuals are now going to be considered culpable for something that they in turn actually lost their lives for. And then you said the federal government is responsible. Remember, only 25% of the slave owning states in the South owned slaves, not the entire United States. So there's always a case to be made that will strike down this reparations as unconstitutional. Now, was it morally wrong? Absolutely, but it wasn't legally wrong. And here's the thing, you cannot make a case for reparations based upon years of racial inequality. Reparation is a remedy, and you're saying this remedy is supposed to be based on slavery, not on how many Black men are incarcerated. But again, I have to stress the fact that African Americans were the only group of individuals that turned over the raising of their kids to the government. Countless numbers of immigrants have come to this country, poor and impoverished, and they've surpassed African Americans. They experienced the same racism. You know, a white supremacist is not anti-Black, they're pro-white. That means they're racist to every group that is not white. But we're the only one that embraced socialist programs that told us that in order for us to be eligible, we have to stay poor. We took short-term fixes.
Well, there certainly is a lot of discussion about this now, and I want to we don't have a whole lot of time left, and I do want to talk about House Bill 40, and Sandy, I'll ask you to explain what that is. But also, as part of that, There have been a number of attempts since Reconstruction to pay restitution. What gives you any confidence that today there's a greater likelihood of success than in prior periods?
Well, there's so much that Donna Jackson just said that I feel like I need to respond to. It appears we're talking past each other somewhat. I tried to make it clear at the beginning that the case for reparations that we're making is not exclusively for the harms of slavery, that it includes 100 years of legal segregation in the United States. And it's the fact that the federal government is the institution that made slavery legal, it made Jim Crow legal, it turned a blind eye at the host of massacres that took place north, south, east, and west. It is the institution that permits ongoing discrimination to take place. It's the institution that permits mass incarceration to continue. So it is the federal government that is the culpable party. That's who we have to turn to for the bill. I would also add that slavery was something that was nationally legal, insofar as even if it was concentrated disproportionately in the southern states, fugitive slave laws obligated Americans, wherever they were, white Americans, to return enslaved people into their state of bondage. This was a national problem, and it requires a national solution.
So now I would like you to respond to my question, though. What makes you feel that there's more of an appetite for this now?
I think that there's actually a very surprising shift in American attitudes that has taken place, which means that we do have a prospect for serious consideration of a reparations plan. I'm not sure that—
On what basis are you saying that? What poll are you referring to? Some survey?
Yeah, so in the year 2000, a survey that was taken by Ravana Popoff and Michael Dawson, two researchers at the University of Chicago, indicated that only 4% of white Americans endorsed reparations for Black Americans. A similar survey that was taken about 2 years ago indicated that that percentage had risen to about 15%. And then a most recent survey that was conducted by Civics that I'm aware of in June actually indicated that closer to 30% of white Americans now endorse reparations for Black Americans. So this is not a sufficient enough percentage for it to actually happen, but it is certainly a movement in the right direction. And I would add that approximately 30% of Black Americans, like Ms. Jackson, are opposed to reparations. But I think that that largely is a consequence of a misunderstanding about what we have in mind about reparations.
Okay, those are good points. And Donna, the issue of that he makes about government being the problem, it's all the things you're talking about the laws that were passed in the civil rights era and all that, and all the welfare programs and having to stay poor to get benefits would be a fault of the government itself. And what Walter said to me is, he said, the problem that Blacks have in America is because it's the only group the government's tried to help. So how is it that the government has made mistakes? It seems to me, from listening to both of you, has made mistakes both ways.
Well, I would say that welfare was available to everyone. And I think I tried to make this point. Welfare was available to everyone, but only Black families embraced it wholeheartedly. There were people who decided that welfare wasn't the way to go. And so in order for them to get those benefits, they broke up it had the consequence of breaking up Black families because we embraced it more. We felt like it was owed to us. Let me say something about slavery, and I think it's very important. Slavery was horrible. Everybody agrees on that. It was unjust. Racism is horrible, it's unjust, but it's not the problem. The truth of the matter is that it's what was legal at the time, and the courts have to go by what was legal, not what was morally just or unjust. It's what was legal at the time.
Donna, I want to just again get a sense about where we are today in 2021. Sheila Jackson Lee has basically taken the place of John Conyers in pushing House Bill 40, but it's never really gotten any traction. I suspect both of you have different views on this. Sandy, what's your view of Sheila Jackson Lee's efforts, our Congresswoman from Houston, Texas?
I think it's a good idea to have a commission that would provide Congress with proposals for reparations, comprehensive proposals. I don't believe H.R. 40 is the legislation that would accomplish that in its present form.
And Donna, your thoughts?
Well, I think that is telling that they appointed a commission, and not everyone says a commission, but they don't say that we're supporting it. Because what I believe is going to happen is the commission will do a study and they'll come back and say it's inconclusive and we can't go forward.
Donna, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And Sandy, I'm going to give you the last 30 seconds if you don't mind.
Yeah, the last thing I'd like to say is that reparations is not a matter of individual guilt or personal responsibility. It's a matter of national obligation, and that's why we turn to the federal government. It's the federal government that created the conditions that maintain Black inferiority and a lack of the material conditions for full Black citizenship. And so we argue that it's the federal government that must pay the bill.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Donna and Jim. What a great discussion. We always talk about perspectives on things that are important, things that matter, and this is about as important as they come in this particular environment that we're in. Catch us on McCuistionTV.com, follow us on Twitter. Thanks again for joining us, and please join us every week as we talk about perspectives that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.